Welcome everyone to this EPRS online event, which is organized by the European Parliamentary Service, which was established last year and which I head. You will be able to ask questions for the Q&A towards the end of this event using the chat function. This is part of a series of events about 70 years of the European Parliament, or to be historically accurate, of the creation of the Common Assembly of the European Coal and Steel Community. We focus today on the role of the European Parliament in promoting the democratic reform of the present-day European Union in historical and contemporary perspective, bringing together historians and social scientists, as well as leading MEPs from the EP. Markus Winkler has kindly agreed to introduce this event. He was the head of cabinet during both of Martin Schulz's mandates as EP president. Since 2016, he serves as Deputy Secretary General of the European Parliament and Director General of the Director General for the Presidency. In this role, he was also responsible for administratively coordinating the EP's position on the Conference for the Future of Europe, which was concluded last year. Over to you, Markus.
Many thanks, Wolfram, and many thanks to the organizers for the invitation. I welcome all participants. I've been asked to provide an introduction of a few minutes to today's seminar. This promises to be an exciting event with a lineup of great speakers. This week's and month, we are marking quite a few 70th anniversaries. The European Parliament commemorated its 70 years in a plenary event in November 22. Today's seminar marks 70 years of Parliament's first push for a European Constitution, which I will discuss in a moment. I wish to use my introduction to highlight a number of milestones in Parliament's 70-year history. These milestones mark Parliament's efforts to push for greater democratic control, accountability, and more democracy. They indicate the development of European democracy and the role of the European Parliament. Milestone number 1. Today's seminar marks 70 years of Parliament's first proposal for a constitution for Europe, the European Political Community, EPC, proposed in March 1953. The EPC was already foreseen in Article 38 of the European Defence Community Treaty, so the Treaty of Paris. The members of the then ad hoc assembly, forerunner of the European Parliament, and some additional members regarded the EPC as a draft constitution for Europe. The text, drafted between September 1952 and March 1953, proposed the following elements: a directly elected assembly, a senate appointed by national parliaments, a supranational executive accountable to parliament, and the creation of a customs union and a common market. All this is reality to us now, 70 years later, but this was quite a revolutionary in 1953. The European Political Community project failed in 1954 due to the resistance from the French Assemblée Nationale. The Assemblée refused to ratify the European Defence Community. They feared an unacceptable loss of national sovereignty. As a result, the European Political Community idea had to be abandoned. Milestone number 2, the road to the Single European Act, the single market, direct elections, and budgetary powers. Although the EPC was dropped, the ad hoc assembly of 1952-1953 marked the starting point for the European Parliament constitutional activism. Parliament, in its initiative reports drafted in the 60s and 70s, demanded direct elections to the EP, a common voting system, the question of one seat for the EC institutions, etc. Parliament also demanded that the European community be more efficient, more accountable, and democratically legitimate. The activism brought some early successes. The EP obtained budgetary powers in the year of 1970. The EP direct elections became reality in 1979. In 1984, the initiative of Altiero Spinelli, the European Parliament adopted the draft treaty establishing the European Union, with strong cross-party support. It aimed to bring about a constitutional leap via reform of the community institutions. The draft treaty on the EU was not ratified by national parliaments. Instead, it created ideas for further democratic reform of the EC, led to the Intergovernmental Conference and the Single European Act signed in 1986 and came into effect in 1987 under the Delors Commission. This act was the first major revision of the 1950-70 Treaty of Rome. Its primary achievements are the objective to establish the single market by end December 92, which the European Parliament marked in its plenary event in January 23, the forerunner of the European Union Common Foreign and Security Policy, CFSP, and it introduced the cooperation procedure. The milestone number 3 I want to highlight is the Constitutional Convention of 2002-2003. Jumping forward to the 21st century, we can see history repeat itself. A bold federalist vision, the draft constitution being defeated in the ratification process due to fears of loss of sovereignty, lack of accountability, or fears of potential threats to the European social model. This is something I remember already as a staffer of the European Parliament. I think also a further panelist, Guy Verhofstadt, has still very active memory on this, as he was the Prime Minister of Belgium at the time, and he chaired the Laken European Council in December 2001, which adopted the Laken Declaration on the Future of Europe. The Constitution was a strong push by the European Parliament for a new, more inclusive and more parliamentary process to achieve substantial treaty reform, a Constitution for Europe. This push came after the limited changes in the Treaty of Amsterdam and Nice. In the Constitutional Convention, then incumbent and former MEPs played a crucial role. Its ratification failed following the negative referenda in France and the Netherlands in 2005. Still, a number of core elements of the Constitutional Treaty survived in the Lisbon Treaty, which is until now still our base to act. Milestone number 4 is, in my eyes, the Spitzenkandidaten principle, so the lead candidate principle. It's an invention by the European Parliament and its leadership at the time that started and shared this vision for Europe. It was first proposed in 2014 elections and successfully implemented because the PPE lead candidate Jean-Claude Juncker managed to get via this Spitzenkandidaten function into the post of a Commission President. This was at the time seen as a clear advantage for European election campaigns. It was also seen as a power shift from the European Council towards the European Parliament. So it was seen as a big success, and therefore the 2019 elections were also seen in the European Parliament as a big backlash, as none of the Spitzenkandidaten managed to get the job. But Ursula von der Leyen instead was proposed by the European Council. So hopefully this would be held in the 2024 elections, because it would be a huge advantage also for European parliamentarian democracy if this would be the principle for the future. The milestone number 5 is the conference on the future. This was not just a renewal in content, but also in the form. On the form, we had a double innovation. For the first time, we invited citizens from 27 member states to participate in a deliberate process with us. 4 panels with 200 citizens each, held over 3 weekends in 24 languages. This was a world first. And the second, the confrontation of the outcome of these citizens panels with the politicians, members of European Parliament, national and European ministers, commissioners, were fighting about citizens' ideas. This was also a first. The outcome of this confrontation were 49 proposals broken down into 326 specific measures. So with this, we are still dealing. On policy level, these were in areas such as preserving biodiversity, enhancing the EU energy autonomy, strengthening the union social model, while also increasing and preserving the single market were formulated as aims. It was highlighted the need for the union to increase its capacity to act by putting forward the way the European Union operates and remove vetoes by abolishing anonymity and by supporting unions' ability to act abroad. Within the Parliament, we are currently reflecting on how to continue this experiment. So if I can conclude, I'm sure you will, during the seminar, see clearer what achievements we obtained over the last 70 years. And Parliament has achieved a lot in pushing for more democracy and parliamentary control in the service of European citizens, and that these efforts must continue as we cannot sit on our laurels. I hope the seminar will be successful in connecting academic insights into the EP's agitation for democratic reform. I thank you for your invitation and for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Markus Winkler, for starting us off with these historical and contemporary perspectives on the role of the European Parliament in promoting the democratic reform of the EU. Now, this will be followed by 3 short 10-minute presentations about 3 of the key moments in the EP's constitutional activism, which Markus Winkler has already referred to. The European Parliament's work to reform the present-day EU, of course, included many small steps, as they were in fact called in the 1970s and 1980s EP language. So this would have included changing its own rules of procedure to assert its influence, negotiating interinstitutional agreements with the Commission and the Council, or drawing on European Court of Justice decisions to strengthen its own position in policy making. Today, however, we focus on what could be called 3 constitutional moments of EP initiatives to create or to reform treaties, initiatives that failed, but that we will see nevertheless left a very strong lasting imprint on the EU's historical trajectory. The first of these was, as mentioned by Markus Winkler already, the European Political Community draft treaty that the ad hoc assembly of the ECSC passed 3 days from today, 70 years ago. Joining us from Rome to discuss the EPC experience is Sandro Guerrieri, a professor of history of political institutions at Sapienza University. His main research areas are the institutional history of the European Community and European Union, the history of 20th century French political institutions, and the constitutional history of the Italian Republic. In 2016, he published a book in Italian about the Common Assembly of the European Coal and Steel Community in the 1950s. He's currently working on the European constitutional process from 1999 to 2005. Over to you, Sandro.
Thank you very much for the invitation. The project of European Political Community, approved on 10 March 1953, was by the ad hoc assembly, was the first attempt to build a European political community on a constitutional basis. This project, as it has been underlined, was linked to the creation of the European Defence Community. As Italian Prime Minister Alcide De Gasperi, who at the time was strongly influenced by the federalist ideas of Altiero Spinelli, had asked to incorporate the European Defence Community into a broader political community, founded on democratic principle. The government of the 6 member states of the community accepted this proposal. The other five governments accepted this proposal, and they asked the Parliamentary Assembly of the European Coal and Steel Community, that is the Common Assembly, to draw up this political project. The Assembly of the ECSC accepted this request, adopting the name of ad hoc assembly. In this first experience of a constitutional process, the initiative was therefore taken by the governments. But they did so because they were very much influenced by the Europeanist associations which had been created after the war and which had joined together in the European movement. Many members of these associations were also members of the ad hoc Assembly, so that they were a sort of driving force of the works of this assembly. It is worth noting that some of the most prominent personalities of the ad hoc assembly, as President Paul-Henri Spaak, Fernando Hus, Lodovico Benvenuti, also belonged at that time to the Comité d'études pour la Constitution européenne, which was a group of study founded by the European movement in order to give legal support to the work for a constitutional Europe, for the drafting of a project of a European constitution. It was not easy anyway to achieve a broad consensus inside the ad hoc assembly because, first of all, the diversity of national interests. For instance, the Dutch delegates placed absolute priority to the objective of creating a common market based on the free movement of goods, capitals, and persons, while the Italian delegation was more interested in the supranational aspects of the project. Some members of the ad hoc assembly did not want to go much beyond the functionalist approach, while others supported the confederal vision centered on intergovernmental cooperation. As a result, the final project adopted by the ad hoc assembly put together a number of different elements. The government system was based on a relationship between parliament and the executive that mirrored many aspects of parliamentary systems in national contexts. Parliament has two chambers, the Senate, which was elected by national parliaments, and the Chamber of the Peoples that was directly elected by the citizen. And this was a very important point because it was the keystone of the construction of the European democracy. The president of the European executive was to be elected by the Senate, and the executive as a whole had to obtain the confidence of both chambers. What about the national governments? They were also called to play a significant role as they were associated in some cases to the decision-making process. Now, one of the most important innovations of the project was that the community was given the mission to contribute to the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms in member states. It was a very important step in the development of the concept of the European Union as a community of shared values. The other tasks of the community were the security against all aggressions. This was the specific task of the European Defence Community, the coordination of certain aspects of foreign policies of member states, and the progressive establishment of a general common market. The draft project of this project of the European Political Community, approved by the ad hoc assembly, was therefore a mix of federalism, functionalism, and confederal intergovernmentalism. This mix of different elements was not static and was able to evolve over time towards a more direct federalist orientation. It would have been possible to fully exploit the potentials of a constitutional supranationality legitimated by popular participation and parliamentary control. But as we know, the course of events took a very different path. First of all, some governments were a little bit frightened by the supranational characteristics of this project. So after being the promoters of this constituent process, the governments became a hindering factor. But the project of the ad hoc assembly was definitively abandoned when the French National Assembly, as it has been reminded, rejected the treaty establishing the European Defence Community. This rejection provoked implicitly the rejection at the same time of this project of political community. But it is necessary to underline that this experience of the ad hoc assembly was quite important for many aspects. First of all, it showed that the European Parliamentary Assembly could draw up a coherent draft of political Europe on a constitutional basis, and this was an important precedent. Moreover, many aspects included in this project were going to influence the European integration in the subsequent decades. The proposal of a common market based on the free movement of goods, capital, and persons was at the core of the Treaty of Rome of 1957. The idea of a parliament elected directly by the citizens was included in the treaties of Rome, and in 1960 the European Parliamentary Assembly already drew up a proposal for an electoral European system. The European Parliament, moreover, developed the concept that the European community was not just a form of economic cooperation, but was a community of values. In 1962, when Franco's Spain presented its request for an association to the community, the European Parliament underlined the importance for the states which wanted to associate to the community or to join it of having a democratic regime, and it confirmed this position in 1967 after the military coup d'etat in Greece. As I said, the ad hoc assembly had stated that the European community had also the task to contribute to the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the member states, and I think that this is one of its most important legacies, which, in our time, has certainly not lost its relevance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandro, for this very interesting and succinct introduction into the EPC and its legacy. The second major constitutional moment, which Markus Winkler has already introduced to us, was arguably the draft treaty on European Union passed by the European Parliament in 1984. I will now talk about the DTEU based on the research for my 2018 EPRS study about the EP and institutional reform in the 1980s. At the time, I was a professor of European Studies at the University of Portsmouth and visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. Since April 2022, I also head the newly established European Parliament History Service in a part-time role. I've recently published another major EP-related study, a book with Luciano Bardi and 3 other colleagues on the history of the EPP group, which is the first study of any EP group's history. A little bit about the background. The DTEU goes back to an initiative by Altiero Spinelli in 1980, an Italian member of the European Commission until 1976, and MEP from 1976 until his death in 1986, elected on the list of the Italian Euro-communists, but not a member of any political party. There were 4 key preconditions for his initiative and the EP's eventual support for the 1984 DTEU. First of all, the limits of the policy of small steps that I've already mentioned. The EP passed a number of reports between 1980 and 82 about institutional reform by Jean Rey, Karel van Miert, Klaus Hensch and others about relations with the Commission, with the Council, the legislative process, etc. Some minor reforms by way of interinstitutional agreements resulted, but no fundamental change in the role of the EP in the European communities. So there was also widespread disillusionment with the process leading to the direct elections of the EP, the lack of a uniform electoral system, and no legislative powers for the EP. The EP was also angry in 1980 over the conflict over the EC budget. The third point was that there was strong representation of broadly federalist-minded MEPs in the first directly elected EP, as before, facilitating cross-party support for the Spinelli initiative. And finally, there was a widespread belief that the direct elections provided the EP with an entirely different level of political legitimacy. Polls prior to the elections had also confirmed high levels of support for the democratic reform of the EC, both among candidates and citizens in most member states. This Spinelli and others believed the EP could draw upon to establish itself as a quasi-constituent assembly. Spinelli created the Crocodile Club in the summer of 1980, a federalist intergroup in the EP for cross-party cooperation and lobbying, for giving priority to working towards a draft constitution named after the still existing Strasbourg restaurant. Key challenge for Spinelli at the time was to secure broad support in the parliament, and especially from among socialists, in view of the deep split in the UK Labour Party, with the majority of MEPs actually supporting Brexit at the time, and the slow reorientation of the French Socialist Party towards a greater emphasis on EC political reform, not just redistributive policies. Spinelli's original aim was to create an ad hoc committee, much like the 1952-53 ad hoc committee, to draw up a draft constitution. However, his ideas were initially discussed in the institutional subcommittee of the Political Affairs Committee, and then in the newly created Institutional Affairs Committee after 1982, which is now the Constitutional Affairs Committee. Spinelli worked closely with Willy Brandt, the Socialist International leader, and with the Socialist Group leader and deputy leaders Ernest Glyn and Rudi Arndt to maximize support, particularly among socialists. But he also established a good rapport with Egon Klepsch, the German EPP group chair, once more from 1982 onwards, to limit dissent among Christian Democrats, motivated by the EPP group's desire to retain its political role as federalist engine, as the then most united group on the institutional deepening of the EC. Spinelli also enlisted the support of Martin Bangemann, the Liberal group leader, and several other leading MEPs for his initiative. Eventually, on 14th of January 1984, 237 MEPs voted for the DTEU, 31 against, and 43 abstained. The result masked greater divisions in the parliament and some of the national delegations, especially the British Labour and Conservative delegations, where many MEPs did not show up for the vote to avoid making these divisions even more visible. Moreover, Spinelli had only achieved the passing of the DTEU with a significant majority by agreeing to and even initiating several compromises. One was the superficial references in the DTEU to the aim of economic and monetary union. At this time, not just the member state governments, but also the EP groups were still deeply divided, both over the aim as such and over the desirable character of economic and monetary union. Another compromise was Spinelli's idea to formally legalize the 1966 Luxembourg Compromise and idea of a national veto for a transitional period in the DTU of 10 years to facilitate the eventual transition to majority voting in the Council, a gesture especially in the direction of reluctant French MEPs and national-level policymakers at the time. With these and several other compromises, Spinelli garnered enough support for his innovative proposal for the direct ratification of the DTEU by a minimum of 6 of 10 national parliaments, which would have allowed an integration core to forge ahead in the face of the likely rejection of the DTEU, at least by the British and Danish parliament. However, while most national parliaments passed supportive resolutions, none ratified the DTEU. Instead, the member state governments established the Doha Committee and eventually negotiated the Single European Act through an intergovernmental conference, a reform that only marginally strengthened the EP's legislative powers. What about the long-term impact of the DTEU? Like the EPC, the DTEU was never ratified, but it still had significant impact on the trajectory of the Parliament and of the present-day EU. Inside the EP, it created new institutional path dependencies, for example, with the constitution of a separate, then still called Institutional Affairs Committee. The DTEU experience also sharpened the understanding among MEPs of the need, following the end of the dual mandate just after the direct election of 1979, to put their relationship with national parliaments onto a new footing to maximize support for their reform demands. This led inter alia to the creation of the COSAC organization for cooperation between the EP and national parliaments in conjunction with the Maastricht Treaty negotiations. The DTEU process also influenced debates in key national parties about the future of the EC. In particular, French socialist MEPs supportive of the DTEU worked closely with Lionel Jospin, the first secretary of the PS after 1981 and MEP during 1984 to 1988, as well as Jacques Delors, previously an MEP and later Commission President. They were instrumental in pushing the French PS in the direction that Mitterrand as president was then to take after 1983, with huge impact on the Maastricht Treaty negotiations. More generally, the EP exerted strong pressure on the member state governments to do something about the democratic deficit, chiefly by giving the EP at least a voice in the appointment of the Commission and substantial legislative powers. Two immediate effects of this pressure were Delors' voluntary decision in 1984 to seek the approval of the EP and the government's decision to create the Doha Committee and to call the IGC that led to the Single European Act. Paradoxically, however, I think this is really important, The EP also contributed to the EU's growing legitimacy issues from the 1990s onwards. It continuously talked up during the 1970s and 1980s the democratic deficit notion to justify its own demands for greater powers for itself. But the likes of Farage later drew on existing tropes of this narrative for their own Eurosceptic purposes to avoid the deepening of European integration or even achieve something like Brexit. And this complicated the EP's role and work when it had acquired greater powers, particularly after the Maastricht Treaty. In the debate about the democratic reform of the EC, the DTEU closed off some options, especially the idea propagated by the 1953 EPC of a second chamber of member state MPs, which would have been closer to the US model. In the DTEU, this was replaced with a Senate constituted of government representatives, confirming the path towards the present-day duality between the Council and the EP in legislation. The DTU also identified and provisionally codified several key legal clauses that found their way into subsequent treaty revisions. This concerns, for example, the formal definition for the first time now, and Sandro has already pointed out that this was already in the 1953 EPC, but not in the same formalization of EC membership criteria and the possibility of sanctions already here in the DTEU for member states breaching key constitutional norms. Concretely, the DTEU for the first time came up with a legal definition of the subsidiarity principle, which found its way directly into the Maastricht Treaty. The DTEU process lastly exhausted the idea of the European Parliament as a constituent assembly. In the 1990s, the EP therefore began advocating a new approach to treaty reform, which eventually culminated in the 2002-3 Constitutional Convention. And this is what Ariadna Ripoll-Servant will now discuss. Ariadna is joining us from Salzburg, where she is Professor for Politics of the European Union at the Department of Political Science and Academic Director of the Salzburg Center for European Union Studies. Her main research interests include European integration, EU institutions, and informal decision-making processes. In 2018, she published the book, The European Parliament with Palgrave Macmillan. Ariadna, over to you.
Thank you, Wolfram, and thanks for the invitation. So indeed, right, so we've now seen that this shift to a convention was a very important step, and Markus Winkler has also pointed it out, that it was very much this feeling that Amsterdam and Nice had not really achieved what they were supposed to achieve, and that we needed another form of reforming the treaties. And of course, we have to remember that at that point, that the European Parliament was an institution that was seen as an ascending force. As you mentioned, it had achieved this introduction of co-decision, the extension of co-decision, a bigger role also in at least appointing the president of the commission, and also, of course, made very much use of this idea of the democratic deficit, which was, of course, increasing, especially since Maastricht and the fact that the European Union had won many more political competences, right? Not just economic, but also political competences. I think I'll leave a bit kind of the background of how we got to a convention and the role also played by Guy Verhofstadt, because he's here and probably he can also assess better how much the European Parliament was involved in this process. But I wanted to kind of look rather at the outcome of the convention and also why the European Parliament played such an important role there, and especially also what has been now the legacies of the convention. I mean, the first point is like that many saw the European Parliament as being one of the winners of the convention, especially in terms of like symbolical aspects, such as calling it a constitution. Many of the issues that had already come up in previous occasions, also now in the Spinelli initiative that we've just heard about. So, for instance, this idea of a legislative council of ministers, getting more powers to decide on the budget, especially on big expenditures such as agriculture, the codification of legal principles such as supremacy. And also especially this idea of making co-decision and qualified majority voting in the council the normal way of deciding on legislative matters. And I think that that's interesting that at that point it was seen as a symbolic point. And I'll come back to this later. And what some people who've looked into this, and you have a reference also now in the chat. So some people who've looked at this process of the convention have remarked that having a convention was extremely important for the European Parliament for several reasons, because it gave it an advantage in the sense, first of all, of course, that it had a seat in there, and that it could actually have a voice, not just from the outside, but also from the inside. The fact that there was a plenary and that it also had seats in the presidium, it allowed it to set the agenda, to set the timing also of the decisions of the different phases of the convention. So that, of course, was a huge difference compared to other processes of treaty reform. The second point was, of course, that that MEPs who were sitting there were politicians, right? So they spoke a different language. They could stress the symbolic aspects. They could really have a different type of use of language, of rhetoric in these plenaries. And then, of course, the fact that the European Parliament had both material resources, such as having personnel to support them, having financial support, and also immaterial resources, such as being used to speaking in plenary, or being used to building coalitions across partisans line, across different institutions. And I think that one thing that was also extremely important is very similar to what Wolfram now said, also the composition of the members that represented the European Parliament. So these were people who had networks that went that went across both the national lines and also the partisan lines. Most of them were people who had been working in the European Parliament for a very long time, some of them already since 1979, who had already been involved in many of these discussions, these debates about constitutional reform, about the democratization of the European Union. And I think they also shared certain characteristics in the sense of being, most of them, from a certain generation. So the oldest member was Hensch, who was born in 1936. The youngest member was born in 1962. But most of them were kind of this post-war generation. And I think that that kind of probably gave them a certain view on history, on the process of European integration. Most of them came from or had an experience either with institutional affairs committee or with a constitutional affairs committee, with budgets committee. So they were also used to dealing with the rules of procedure, with the treaty reforms, also with working with other institutions on budgetary negotiations. And that, of course, made them also they had a certain bias in the sense that most of them were very strongly pro integration, supported also by a staff, so the civil servants from the European Parliament that came from a similar generation, a similar background, and also being very strongly pro integration. And what that made was also that they reflected a certain mainstream. So they reflected this kind of center-right, center-left mainstream, with the liberals, of course, also supporting this, that represented a consensus on the reform, on what should be achieved, what the role of the European Parliament should be. And of course, many of them, especially the main actors, came from big member states, which also gave them a certain weight, a certain legitimacy. And so that, of course, helped to also then create this idea that there was a consensus surrounding the idea that there had to be a reform, that the constitution was important, that the symbolic aspects were important. And what is paradoxical, of course, is that then it didn't work, right? That the constitutional treaty was not supported, and it failed precisely in referenda. And so what are the legacies? I mean, despite this failure, despite the inability to really have this profound reform of the system, what are the legacies of the constitutional treaty and this process of having a convention instead of an intergovernmental conference? The first one is, of course, very obvious, right? So many parts of the constitutional treaty were incorporated into the Treaty of Lisbon. And of course, some of these more kind of symbolic issues were not incorporated, especially the name of a constitution or the fact that we could have a legislative council of ministers. But some other important aspects for the European Parliament were incorporated, and the idea of the Spitzenkandidaten, which of course is not in the treaty, but it is incipient. There is kind of at least a rule there that allowed this was there, and of course, especially this idea of the ordinary legislative procedure, and also, for instance, the consent, the reform of the consent procedure. And this has really, we've realized this is not just symbolic, right? This has really restructured EU politics to a great extent, both for good and for bad, right? So the fact that now, for instance, we work mostly with trilogues, that there is really a very close dialogue between the different institutions, that the European Parliament is really now taken seriously, that it's fully part of the legislative procedure, that it has much more influence than in the past. These are, of course, things that the European Parliament has achieved because of the reforms of the Treaty of Lisbon, also in many more policy areas. Of course, the Treaty of Lisbon also gave more importance to the European Council, and this is also something that has become more of an issue now in recent years, especially with all the crises. I think that the second legacy that we have from the convention is that the European Parliament realized that it had some assets that it could use also in normal times. One of them is, of course, this idea of unity, that if they were united, that if they had kind of a cross-partisan consensus on what they wanted to push for, and if they use also this idea of the democratic deficit and the need for the European Parliament to be present and to be involved, that of course helped also in pushing the interests or pushing the ideas of the European Parliament. On the other hand, it also kind of brought home this idea of the need to mature. And this is, for instance, something that I remember also coming across when then co-decision was expanded around 2008, 2009, becoming more and more important, this idea that the European Parliament had to become more mature, that it could not just have extreme positions and unrealistic positions, but that it had to become part of this compromise and part of this mainstream and become part of more of like these centrist positions. And this we've seen that it has become more and more important, this push towards the center, this push towards the idea that you cannot have just a wish list. And of course, the question is also, I mean, despite, Parliament realizing that unity is very important, whether it could be able to do the same thing again. If we had again now a convention, could we still have this kind of consensus and unity and mainstream push for a more pro-integration in treaty reform? I'm not sure, right? So with a much more polarized European Parliament, this might be an issue at the present. And the last point that I want to make is about, and Markus Winkler already touched on it, about also the legacy in terms of realizing that having more actors involved was good for the democratic process. It was necessary, which of course has also now pushed for this idea to also involve citizens. So citizens were not really involved in the convention, but at the same time also creating this paradox of them making it much more high profile, creating more expectations for reform, for democratic involvement, and then also creating them more potential for failure when it comes to referenda. And that made it, of course, made everyone very reluctant to repeat this experience of treaty reform. And so that's also a bit my kind of open question for the future. Now that we've seen this conference on the future of Europe, what next, right? Can we now have a treaty reform? Is this something we wish? And then it doesn't make also difference the fact that now not just parliaments were involved and the European Parliament, but also citizens. And I'll stop with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both of my colleagues for their discussion of key constitutional moments in the history of the EP and the EU, and in particular for highlighting their respective long-term legacies, which are arguably not very well understood in much of the social science literature. We now move on to two key MEPs who've been heavily involved in the democratic reform debate within and beyond the EP. They will hopefully relate the earlier EP experiences that we discussed to their own, with the Conference on the Future of Europe concluded last year, and to their views how EU democratic reform could and should proceed in the future. Each of you now has 15 minutes before we have time for questions and answers, and questions to be asked by participants through the chat function, please. We start with Guy Verhofstadt, who is a member of the European Parliament and former co-chair of the Conference on the Future of Europe. He was Prime Minister of Belgium from 1999 until 2008, and Markus Winkler reminded us that already then, as Prime Minister of Belgium, he played a crucial role concerning the Laeken Declaration and the Constitutional Convention. And in this role, he was already very active on this front. He was then elected to the European Parliament in 2009, where he chaired the group of Liberals and Democrats, as it was called at the time, until 2019. He's now a member of the Renew group. He also made a name for himself as Brexit coordinator and as a passionate champion of more European integration to tackle the multiple crises the EU is facing. His latest book is entitled Europe's Last Chance. Mr. Verhofstadt, over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope that everybody can hear me. I have to tell you that after following the three introductory presentations on the European political community, the draft treaty of the Union of '84, and then the failure of the Constitutional Convention, I became a little bit depressive of all this. Even when we have to recognize that after every of these attempts to establish an integrated and democratic and European Union, there was always a fallout of these attempts that was in a certain way positive. And so the failure in 53, 54 to have a European political and defense community based on the von Brantano constitutions led to the Treaty of Rome, a customs union mainly, was you could say sort of a type of a leftover of the failure of 53, 54. And the failure of establishing a draft treaty for the European Union by the Parliament in '84, the leftover of that was later on the single act, and you could even say the Amsterdam and Maastricht treaties, and the failure to have a constitution based on the convention in 2000, in the period 2002-2005, was the Lisbon Treaty. So even when these three attempts were not successful, in 53, in 84, in the period in 2000, ultimately in 2005, with the negative outcome of the referenda in France and the Netherlands, there was always a sort of we recuperated a few elements of that process. And that was the Treaty of Rome, the Maastricht and Amsterdam treaties, and later on the Lisbon Treaty. But that doesn't mean that the problems we are facing have been solved by all these treaties: Treaty of Rome, Amsterdam, Maastricht, and the Lisbon Treaty. And that's the reason why we started a new attempt, where we try to combine two elements that are new, that didn't exist in 53 and 84 or in 2002, and that is a huge involvement of citizens, the Conference on the Future of Europe, that have produced a number of very clear conclusions, wishes by citizens. And at the other hand, the possibility in the Lisbon Treaty for the Parliament to launch a new type of convention based on Article 48 that requires only a simple majority in the Council to be launched. And we are in the middle of that process. Why? Well, because we have seen, based on the requests of the citizens, on the outcome of the conference, that people like Europe are very much in favor of the European project, but they are very critical towards the effectiveness of the European Union today. People believe in Europe. They think that their future is Europe, a European framework, a European Union, but they are at the same time very critical towards the way the European Union works today. And what they are asking for is a more effective European Union. And most of the conclusions of the conference on the future of Europe are dealing with these issues. End of the unanimity rule, for example, in Council, that is blocking decisions, creating an energy union, establishing a defense union, what was already on the tables in 53, 54, giving a bigger role to Parliament with legislative initiative, also establishing a new role for the citizens in the future based on the experience of the conference. I only give these elements to remember, to recall that the Conference on the Future of Europe has established in total 49 and a few hundreds of recommendations that clearly shows the need for a huge reform of the Union. In the sense, I would say, that has been undertaken already in the 50s and the 80s with the first constitution attempt to have a constitution, and the second one in 84 with the draft treaty on the European Union. Where we are in the process, well, as you know, Parliament with the resolution has sent a request to start a convention based on Article 48. It's the first time that it is happening in the history of the European Union, that the Parliament used that power in the treaties, and mainly that request was based on on ending the unanimity rule in different fields of the decision-making process of the Union. And as we all know, the Council, who can approve this with a simple majority, with this a low threshold, I would say, compared to all the other fields, has not reacted, even not reacted to that initiative, saying and stating that, yeah, they are waiting for a more global proposal of treaty revision by the Parliament. And the Parliament has started that exercise. I am the lead rapporteur in that file, and we will we will propose to the plenary probably in the July session a global revision of the treaties that incorporates, that is based on the wishes, the requests, the proposals made by the citizens during the conference on the future of the Union, including abolishment of the unanimity rule, including establishing energy and health and defense unions, and trying to simplify the way the European Union works today. So then we will see if in July, when during the Spanish presidency, there is a will inside the Council with a simple majority to start that new initiative. Like I said, it's a completely new initiative because it's based on Article 48 and what is a new way forward created in the Lisbon Treaty, and that would make it possible to have a way to a new treaty based on the reports that will be produced by the Parliament in the upcoming months. So let's say that after the failures of 53, 54, 84, and 2002, this will be hopefully the final successful attempt to reform the European Union in the way that is necessary. Why I'm saying in the way that is necessary, because let's be honest, in the world of tomorrow, in this new age of empires in which we live, where empires like China, India, the US and unfortunately Russia are deciding world affairs, there is an absolute need for a more effective, more democratic, more resilient, and more sovereign Europe, and that is the aim of the work we are preparing now in this new report of the Parliament, and what will be launched together with a new request, Article 48 of the treaties. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these fascinating insights, Guy Verhofstadt. We are now moving on to the second MEP who has joined us today from what looks like a flight hangar, Gwendoline Delbos-Corfield. She was born in Britain but grew up in France and studied in Grenoble, where she was elected municipal councillor and then regional councillor. Member of the Committee of the European Green Party from 2012 to 2019. She has always linked her local political commitment with her European commitment. In the European Parliament, she is a member of the Greens and involved in constitutional issues, civil liberties, rule of law, digital rights, and equality. Gwendoline, over to you.
Yes, I have a bit of a transport problem, so I'm in an airport, so it might make a bit of noise, and it's not a very nice landscape, but we'll try to do it that way anyway. Hello, everyone. Of course, I don't have the knowledge and the expertise of Mr. Verhofstadt, who is one of the huge figures of all of these battles and these discussions. I'm a much younger part of the story, and my interest comes, in fact, and I would like to start from it, from this experience in the board of the European Green Party. Greens were basically born also out of Europe. The evolution of this new political world and ideas is very, very much linked to Europe, not only because indeed since the beginning most of the green parties were created with an optic of being pro-European and very involved in the European construction, but also because Europe was for a long time, the European Union and the European Parliament was where we could have a little success because of proportional elections, and so we could have green elected people. And we've been working for years now to have a very common program manifesto and a common work. And this is where I come from, and the idea of having a real involvement on the European level from the beginning, not coming from a national party and then involving yourself in the parliament, but really coming from a European party. We do see also now new parties that are deciding to create themselves from the European level, like Volt, which I think is an interesting evolution, even if we're very far still from having success for this. And I will come back to this also in the discussion about council and the relationship with council. So that's where I come from. When I got to parliament, it was obvious for me that I would go in the AFCO committee. I would like just to say a few words about that. I think it's an essential committee, but it is we do have a problem, I think, today in the fact that this committee is a committee of the geek ones, the nerd ones. It's probably always was the case, but I also have the feeling that you had major figures from this committee. Today it's a committee where a number of things are stuck because also of conservatism, even if on federalist opinion, of course, it still is a committee that advanced things. And I think it says something also about how we should move on in the parliament, and how those that have been fighting for a long time, like Guy, can be sometimes a bit alone in going on with their fight, and how we could create a new enthusiasm on this, even if we've got a few young men very involved from different parties. But for example, we have a big lack of women being involved, and this also say a lot about maybe the evolution today that we need to have. I also was facing all of these discussions on the evolution through two big topics that I think are crucial. One is the Brexit one, and the other one is the Article 7 procedure that the Parliament triggered towards Hungary, because in these two cases we have articles of the treaties that had never been used. We are trying to use them, putting them in place in a very sometimes hazardous ways, and more successful at other moments. And in this, of course, in all of these topics, we can see that the fact that the member states are sometimes very still in their national, not still, they are very much in their national interest, not being able of thinking outside of a unanimity, even when they're not obliged to. I mean, I think for most of my colleagues in the parliament that are not aware of the rules, most of my colleagues in parliament have never read the treaties, never read the text, don't have the history. So they presume that unanimity is an obligatory thing. And when I say too often to them, you know, council has a number of places where it should not, it's not obliged to go for unanimity. It's a bit of a surprise for most of my colleagues. And because the council has made this such a rule, a cultural consensual rule, and it is becoming a real problem in a number of topics and files. But on the other hand, of course, this very specific term we've been through. I mean, we all, federalists often say that Europe was created through crisis, but this term is really particular. We started the term with the pandemic, and the idea then of recovery plans and solidarity, which meant that we were more solider than we were at the time of the Greek crisis. That was a good thing. And then now, of course, we've got the Ukraine war, where again debates are making things move. So this is one part of the landscape, but the other part is, of course, as I said, that we have a lot of blockage still, and I am not very, I mean, Guy started by saying that it was a bit depressing. It was also for me, because I was feeling how much maybe at some moment there was a great eagerness to move, and I'm not feeling that much that today. So I don't want to be very depressing, but I'm a bit concerned about the situation. Actually, at the moment, of course, you could say on one hand that Viktor Orban, as Prime Minister of Hungary, in his way of blocking things for more than 1 year now. I mean, I think there's not been one cancelled for 1 year where he didn't block one of the decisions until the very last minute, and in a form of blackmailing. You could say that have given the others a bit of a will to go further on consensus, on the majorities instead of unanimity, and seeing the problem of this. But I'm not sure they have. On the other hand, what I can see is that, for example, I am in charge of the file on political parties and foundation in the European Parliament. And the council is really trying once again not to give too much power to European level. They are very afraid of citizens. They are very afraid of involvement of citizens from other countries out of EU. They see this as interference. We in the parliament really fight for the idea that, on the contrary, when we get involved with people in Serbia, in Macedonia, and all of this, it means that we are in fact promoting European values and creating empowerment on European ideas and making the European Union stronger through the borders. But there's a real refusal from the Council of having even a bit of involvement of parties from there, with the stupid the paradox also of refusing, for example, at the moment, I think in the end we will manage it, but for the UK parties to be still in European parties, I mean, this is completely ridiculous. So we can see that in the Council we still are very much in in an intergovernmental way of thinking, in a very timid way of thinking. You have this promise made to Ukraine from some, but in the other hand, nobody is really discussing how this would really happen. People are left on the side, like the accession countries, where the discussions are not very good, and then you've got Mr. Macron and this idea of community of European politics, which I find very, very concerning, because I'm really having the sensation that this is a sort of competitors to Council of Europe in an intergovernmental way, with no implication of citizens, of parliaments, of members of parliament, a way of circumventing more debates and more democracy, and be even more in an intergovernmental discussion. And on the other side, with a parliament that indeed was very strong at the very beginning on the conference on the future of Europe. I mean, a number of stakeholders in the parliament really fighted for this after the proposal was made by Macron also 5 years ago. And in parliament, they really fighted for this. Guy was one of them, and with others, different groups fighted for it. We also fighted for the implication of citizens, which was at the beginning not at all something that a number of stakeholders wanted in the council. So we had this college of citizens. We really managed to get them involved and have a voice. So we could really build on this. But on the other hand, we also see in a number of cases that when Parliament could act in the remits that are these at the moment, there's even in the form of the treaties today and powers of Parliament, it's often that the Parliament is not acting, feeling still very weak, and still trying to always go through the national level and the national consensus, rather than having a real empowerment of the Parliament. And I even have a feeling today that national politics are interfering a lot in our everyday work. And I think that I'm coming back to my first point. I think it's interesting because I think the one group that had never had really the national context being really interfering in their work, which was the Greens, because we were not in governments. Of course, now we are in one government, quite a powerful one, the Germans, and for the first time we are having this on the table. And we can see also that in the different moments where we have concerns about countries that are not going well on rule of law point of view, and I'm not talking here about Poland and Hungary, I'm talking about others, we will immediately go to a fight between political sides in European Parliament, rather than feeling as a European Parliament in charge of monitoring what's happening on these European values in a number of countries, and instead of feeling empowered to go further than national politics and really act as members of Parliament of the European landscape. So I have quite a mixed feeling on the situation, as you can see.
Lillian, thank you very much for your insights. What sounds like quite a pessimistic assessment of the situation that we're in. But on this note, of course, I would like to congratulate you on your birthday, which one of the attendees has reminded us is in fact today, and which you're spending at the airport, which is perhaps not the most pleasant place to spend your birthday. But thank you very much for joining us, in particular on your birthday. Now, I would like to remind the participants that you can ask questions in the chat. There is one question which I would like to pass on to the panelists straight away from Alfredo Di Feo, who is a former leading official in the European Parliament. His impression is, across his career, that maybe in the past the European Parliament had far more limited powers, particularly before the Maastricht Treaty, but as a result of that was perhaps able to be far more inspirational, as he calls it in his question. And now it has powers and influence, but politics is so much dominated by national governments that the Parliament is not managing to find this inspiration. And maybe this is to do also with the internal fragmentation of the European Parliament and the growth of Euroscepticism and so on. So if anyone would like to respond to that in a minute, please go ahead. I've also picked up from the discussion and from your two interventions as MEPs that maybe the role of citizens in the perspective of the European Parliament has changed quite fundamentally. So if we go back to the 1950s, there was no consultation of any citizens' organizations or of individual citizens. Of course, the means didn't exist in the same way as today with the existence of social media, modern forms of communication. In the 1970s, already with the Tindemans report, there was some consultation of organized citizens groups, and similarly in the context of the draft Treaty on European Union, but not individual citizens. And with the Conference on the Future of Europe, it's been a focus on the individual citizens selected through this lottery system. So I'm wondering whether also the view of the European Parliament of the role of citizens in European integration and in relation to the Parliament has changed quite fundamentally over the last 70 years. So would anyone like to come in on either of these two points? Yeah, Verhofstadt?
Well, very short. So there was, in fact, some reluctance by Parliament in the beginning of the process, saying, yeah, but we are elected by the citizens, so why it's necessary to have an involvement of citizens, and that changed during the whole exercise in such a way that we saw that the view that we need absolutely have a permanent citizens representation somewhere in the 5 years cycle of European politics, and in this inside the exercise we are doing, we are trying to find, and that's beyond the citizens initiatives that exist already today and beyond the involvement of citizens in preparing the policies of the European Commission. We think that a sort of a process, a permanent process of involvement of citizens in the 5 year cycle of European politics is needed. And then on the first question, saying, yeah, well, in my opinion, we have still not a European democracy and a European Parliament as we need to have. A European Parliament has no legislative initiative. European Parliament, and that's the most important thing, has no say about the income of the European Union. And we are the only parliament in the world who can say something about expenditures. We have to approve expenditures, but we can have no. We do not the approval of the income. That's completely, that is diminish enormously the power of the European Parliament. So it's true that because of the previous treaties, we can now we have a role to play in the decision making, but if you have not a say on the income of the organization of the European Union, you are still, you have still not the same tools and instruments as the Council have and the Member States have, and that's, in my opinion, also a thing that needs to be solved. Can we give right of initiative to the Parliament, and can we give to the Parliament the power to also, together with Council, approve the income of the Union?
Thank you. Gwendoline, would you like to come in on these questions?
Yes. Well, I think that indeed we do need even citizens now to a bit save us, to be honest. I think that that was the idea between very institutional changes that we were proposing a few years ago, Spitzenkandidat, transnational list, and we need to go on fighting on this. I still believe that, for example, the transnational list would be an interesting tool, only a tool. It's not going to do miracles, but if it was existing, I still believe that the fact of voting even for foreign names and for a French to vote for a Finnish name would be very interesting. So I still think that symbolically transnational names would be very useful. I also think that working more on the way that we discuss the election of the Commission, I mean, in 2019, this idea was basically killed, and I don't know how we will come back on it. And this is also something that made the Parliament weak. But still, I mean, I think we need to go on discussing on this. That sort of institutional changes are still important, but we also indeed need to get the citizens to want to be Europeans, and we need the citizens to feel involved, to have the feeling that we as their representatives are useful. In big countries like Germany or France, European stories are very far from the people, and a European member of parliament is completely useless in the eyes of many French citizens. It's no secret, I think, that for a long time even some French parties would send the people that they needed to get out of national politics, or didn't have a place in national politics, so they could wait in the European place for a bit before they came to the real politics that were the national ones. And so this is still very important. I mean, the media landscape in France about European ideas is dramatic. And until this is the case, people will not understand that they need to get involved. And it's even more crucial that I'm also, one of my other concerns is the fact that on police decision, on justice decision, a number of things today are done. And I think our citizens are not aware of how much powers we are giving through intergovernmental system where the parliament has nearly no scrutiny, through big agencies or through big country member states cooperation, and not through the European level, and so it has implication for everyone's daily life, and they don't realize it. So I think we really need to get the citizens involved. It's not clear how. I think we should reproduce what happened with the Conference of the Future of Europe. It was a first experience that was very interesting, and I want to really say I agree completely on Guy. I remember at the very beginning only the Greens and we knew the Liberals wanted it. For a lot of our colleagues, representative democracy was enough, but we can see that we advanced on this. So it's interesting that we go on this, and then maybe we can also hope that the feeling of Europe as a place of peace, as a place of values in these difficult moments will help us also. Even before the Ukraine war, I would always be very impressed by the way the women in Poland that were fighting for their just women's rights were also using Europe as a theme for their demonstration, and these women that Saturday after Saturdays for months got assaulted, harassed, attacked, beaten up just for defending the right of abortion, were at the same time really saying we want to be part of Europe, and Europe is the place to be. And we see now in Georgia, in Belarus, in Ukraine now, Europe is also again a symbol, as it was a few years ago, and maybe hope had been lost. So the geopolitical context can also help us, and maybe this will bring more citizens to realize that European values are values that they should be defending. And on the first question, of course, I was not in the parliament before, so it's difficult for me to make a real comparison. But I do find that at the moment, no, EP is not inspirational, and that once again, I mean, national politics are since 6 months, 1 year, very much interfering. I saw an evolution through the mandate. Of course, the confinement was a particular moment, but we came in the parliament after a European election where young people had participated. There was this feeling that, you know, the March for the Climate, and a lot of people feeling, and a lot of young people feeling that European level was the good level, had empowered us, and that we were European Union was the right place to do a number of things. The European Parliament felt quite well at the beginning of 2019, and I feel that nowadays we are more and more in fights. Of course, the Qatar Gate has also been a difficult moment for all of us. but I don't feel that the Parliament at the moment is an inspirational place, and there's something there that I don't really understand, because on the other hand, it's a young Parliament. There's quite a long number of young people. There are more women than ever. So we just should be able of working on this. But I mean, the idea that tomorrow, after the next term in this Parliament, there could be a majority right, far right, is not a completely crazy perspective. I think we can avoid it, but it's still a bit there, and this is a gloomy one. And so for the moment, the EP is not a place of inspiration, and we should try to make it again.
Address two other questions and invite first Ariadne and Sandro perhaps to respond to these two questions if you like. One is the question of intergovernmental dominance and whether there's an evolution over time at the national level from the 1950s, perhaps, where there was very strong support in some member states like Italy, arguably more than in others, but basically also in national politics, strong support for, broadly speaking, federalist visions of European integration. Whereas that only seems to be the case to a very limited extent nowadays. Gwendoline has mentioned the French case of Macron, who of course gave the speech at the Sorbonne in 2017, would surely see himself as a very strongly pro-European politician. But then there are nevertheless limits to the support for deepening European integration. So that's one theme in terms of change over time. And then another theme that I think came out with Guy Verhofstadt's reference to the Age of Empires is the question of the role of the international environment. To what extent does that matter for European integration? In the 1950s, 1952, 53, death of Stalin, early détente, that took a lot of the pressure off, arguably. I wonder what Sandro was thinking about this, and maybe made it much more difficult to agree the European Defence Community and the linked European Political Community Treaty. But maybe nowadays, if we do live in an age of empire with all of these threats around, maybe this will actually make it easier for the European Union to integrate in the future. So I wonder, first of all, Sandro and Ariadne, what you have to say about this, and then we'll move to Gwendoline and Guy.
First of all, yes, concerning federalism, there was a strong tradition in Italy since the Ventotene Manifesto of 1941. So in the 40s and in the 50s, a large part of the political class was influenced by federalist idea, especially Prime Minister De Gasperi, who was going to think Europe as an essential dimension for the reconstruction of Europe after the war. And this federalist perspective was very strong in Italy until the beginning of the 90s. For instance, in 1989, there was a referendum in Italy which gave a mandate to the European Parliament, to the Italian representatives to the European Parliament, to promote a constitutional project for Europe. So it was approved with 88% of the electors in 1989. But then the things changed, and Euroscepticism has influenced the Italian public opinion, and we can say that this time of federalism so spread in Italy are over. The other problem, the international context was very important for the experience of the European defense community, because it was the effect of the Korean War. So when the Korean War ended, and with the death of Stalin, there was a sort of detente between the blocs. And for this reason, the idea of creating a common defense was not more seen as an emergency that had to produce a new community. That was one of the factors that provoked the failure of the project, the rejection of the project by the French National Assembly.
Thank you. Ariadne?
So about this kind of intergovernmental dominance, I think that is, I mean, on the one hand, of course, we shouldn't kind of forget that there were already kind of issues with intergovernmentalism in the past, right? And the empty chair crisis in the 60s, this idea of Eurosclerosis, that kind of was already there. So we shouldn't idealize the past and think like everyone was a federalist. But of course, I think that there are two things that have changed substantially. One is, of course, the institutionalization of the European Council and the role it plays now in European politics, especially with the various crises. And it kind of links also a little bit to Alfredo's question about this political influence and inspiration of the European Parliament, right? That the fact that often many of the decisions are already or have to be made by the European Council, that limits very much the room of maneuver also of the European Parliament in the sense of how much can be decided, right? And in the case of the refugee crisis, we saw it very well that because there was deadlock in the European Council, never mind that the European Parliament was very united or that it created some compromises on these issues, nothing could be done on this. And so I think that the role that the European Council is playing, and also the fact that the European Parliament has now come to be seen that because it's more influential, it's also a potential area where there might be more difficulties in pushing things, then it has led also the member states and also the Commission to find alternatives, right? So this idea, for instance, of the role of agencies, but also of informal treaties with third countries, of non-legislative measures and so on, right? So this, of course, is done to often bypass the European Parliament. So that comes, of course, with more powers, yeah? And I think that the other aspect that has changed a lot is indeed this kind of party system at the domestic level. The fact that we have now many more, not just Eurosceptic parties, but also more populist parties, and that they are becoming challengers to these kind of mainstream parties, right? And often these mainstream parties then have to react to them, they have to position themselves, and often many decide to either not open this black box of European integration and federalism and prefer not to speak about it, or they actually adopt exactly the same discourses, the same way of speaking about Europe, the same kind of Euroscepticism as many of these parties that are challenging them at the national level. So I think that really has changed the political system of the European Union.
Thank you, Ariadne. I'm mindful of the time. Maybe we can inverse the order now, Gwendoline and Verhofstadt, if you can, in 1 minute, tell us how you would like the European Parliament and the European Union to proceed with democratic reform in the future.
Yes, well, I think that we need to use the treaties at their maximum, which is not the case. Once again, unanimity should be no more the preferred version of things. They should go to qualified majority as often as they can. I think that the mutual trust is there. We've gone through this moment where member states had to look at each other and try to understand who they were. So I think now they could go really further on a number of things. Of course, we need a legislative power for the parliament, and we need to advance on own resources. Once again, the moment the parliament, the European Union will not be blackmailed by the member states on how it uses the money, it will be very helpful. We need brainstorming. I really think that we are not equipped for the discussions we need on enlargement. We don't know what to do in the next steps. I mean, I'm nobody, I'm not very clever on this. I've not the expertise of many people, and I'm so surprised that I often am the only one saying, so what is this? What is this? I mean, we cannot, it's not true that we can integrate Ukraine tomorrow. What do we do about the Balkans? We integrated one of them, Croatia. It's very unfair for the others. And we are not a functioning democracy, we're an immature democracy. So if we were to involve everyone tomorrow, it would be impossible. We know it would destroy us. So we have the next steps not foreseen. It's not true to say that we have them foreseen. And once again, I don't think that an intergovernmental discussion through this European community is the solution. And I don't see a lot of people brainstorming on this. So that's a great concern. And lastly, of course, we We have a very particular crisis moment that is coming now to know what we do, not only with the arms export with Ukraine, but also how far we go with being indulgent with Poland on the state of rule of law, even if indeed they are an ally in the Ukraine situation compared to Hungary. We need to, yes, to face all of these crises in the next years. And if we manage to face them, interestingly, maybe there is hope. Or maybe we're going to be a bit blocked for a number of years in a functioning European Union institutionally, on an organization point of view, but a European Union that will no more be a place of ideas and of values.
Thank you. Guy Verhofstadt?
Well, very short. I think that the Parliament today doesn't really use the tools and the instruments and the power that they have, that it has. That is the main problem today, because we are approving the budget, for example. If you can approve the budget of blocking it, well, it's already an enormous tool that you have, and we don't use it. So it is intergovernmentalism that is still based on unanimity, that is still governing the European Union and the policies of the European Union. And we see every day that it doesn't work. And the migration crisis is an example of that. The energy crisis is an example of that. In the beginning of the health crisis was an example of that. The way we need 10 packages of sanctions and still it's not sufficient in our fight against the brutality of Russia is an example of that. And I could continue giving you a long list. So my plea would be, in fact, Parliament could take the lead in this reform process if it really has a leadership in which everybody, leaders of the group, say, okay, we're gonna pick up the fight, because politics it's about that story. If you think that you will receive from the Council powers and federal Europe based on majority voting, forget it. So you will never receive it. You have to fight for it, and then you will get it. But to receive it for free, for nothing, never happens in politics.
So this is an excellent, I think, final note to the event today. This was the first event trying to bring history and politics together, and I think it's been rather successful in doing so, and also bringing academics and MEPs together to discuss these kinds of issues. Just like to say very briefly that we have 2 more such events in the next 3 months, one towards the end of April on the 26th of April, where we use the Northern Enlargement of 1973, 50 years of the Northern Enlargement, as a hook to discuss questions and problems of enlargement, also including possible future enlargements. And in June, we will have another event on 70 years of the European Parliament, where we will discuss the formation of the transnational political groups in 1953, and also discuss with former group leaders of the 3 groups that have more or less existed in the last 70 years, how to manage and coordinate a transnational group in a transnational parliament as opposed to a national group in a national parliament. So it remains for me to thank all the panelists very much for their contribution and for their time, especially Gwendoline, perhaps today it's on your birthday, and all the participants also for their contributions to the chat and for listening to this event, and to wish all of you a nice rest of the day. Thank you.